Two halves. That is what remained. The stern pointing at the sky, then gone. The bow already under. The SS Carl D. Bradley, 193 meters of riveted steel, snapped in half on Lake Michigan, November 18th, 1958. 33 men entered water 2 degrees above freezing. The nearest ship was 19 kilometers away. Only 2 men came back alive. The hull fracture records existed long before that night. If the hull fracture records had been acted upon, would those 33 men from Rogers City have come home? The town of Rogers City, Michigan, had fewer than 4,000 residents in 1958. It was a small town built around the limestone industry. Nearly every family in Rogers City had a man aboard the Carl D. Bradley. The ship was not just a vessel, it was the town's primary source of income. The freighter belonged to the Michigan Limestone Division of U.S. Steel. Its hull had been launched 31 years before that November night. By 1958, the Bradley was considered aging by engineering standards. 31 years on the Great Lakes meant 31 winters of thermal stress and hull flex. By the standards of the Great Lakes Fleet, the Bradley was a flagship vessel. Its size made it the pride of the limestone trade routes. On the morning of November 18th, the ship departed Gary, Indiana, running empty. No cargo. Just ballast water in the tanks. An empty hull rides differently than a loaded one. The bow and stern flex independently, with less weight to distribute stress along the keel. Captain Roland Bryan had commanded the Bradley for years. He knew the ship's patterns in rough water better than almost anyone on the fleet. He filed his departure log at 0700 without incident. Nothing in that log entry indicated any concern about the day ahead. Weather forecasts that morning indicated deteriorating conditions by afternoon. The National Weather Service had issued a gale warning for Lake Michigan. The crew of 35 men were not alarmed. November gales on the Great Lakes were routine. Every man aboard had sailed through worse. By mid-afternoon, wind speeds had reached 120 kilometers per hour. The open water north of Beaver Island offered no shelter. The waves were building to 9 meters. Swells of that scale generate a compounding stress on long steel hulls running without a full cargo load. A vessel 193 meters long will have its bow lifted by one wave, while its stern drops into a trough at the same instant. The 2 ends of the ship are pulled in opposite directions simultaneously. The entire hull bends under that load with each passing swell. This motion, called hogging and sagging, is standard physics for any large ship. The question is whether aging steel can absorb the accumulated load. For a hull 31 years old, with documented stress fractures in prior inspection records, that question should have been answered before the season began. At 1725, something gave way near the stern. A crack moved through the ship, followed by a groan along the entire hull length. First, mate Elmer Fleming was on the bridge. He felt the deck shift beneath him in a way that was not a wave. The hull was separating. Captain Bryan reached the radio immediately. At 1731, he transmitted the Mayday. He gave coordinates and said the ship was breaking apart. His voice on the recording is measured and direct. The transmission lasted less than 90 seconds. The radio went silent at 1732. Both sections of the hull sank in under 4 minutes. The stern went first, pulling men directly off the deck and into the churning water below. The water temperature was 2 degrees Celsius. In water that cold, a man loses muscular control within minutes. Consciousness follows shortly after. 33 men entered the lake. Most were never seen alive again. 2 men, Frank Mays and Elmer Fleming, found a life raft in the darkness. The raft was a flat platform with low side rails, designed to keep men out of direct water contact. In 9-meter swells, it gave almost nothing. Mays and Fleming tied themselves to the rails. The water broke over them without pause through the entire night into November 19th. The German freighter Christian Sartori had seen the Bradley's lights before the sinking. Its captain, Paul Wendling, altered course toward the Mayday signal. In Force 10 conditions, the Sartori could not move quickly. 19 kilometers took hours. Every minute of that transit, men were in the water. The Coast Guard cutter Sundew departed Charlevoix after receiving the relayed Mayday. But Charlevoix was farther away. The weather made speed impossible. Through the night, the search produced only debris, life rings, pieces of wood, an oil slick spreading across the surface of the lake. At dawn, the Sartori's searchlights swept the debris field again. The raft was not at the coordinates where the hull had gone down. It had drifted approximately 3 kilometers northeast, driven by the same wind that had broken the ship hours before. A Coast Guard helicopter from Traverse City spotted the raft at first light. 2 figures lay flat on the platform. The pilot could not tell if either was alive. Both survivors were pulled aboard the Sartori in a state of severe hypothermia. Fleming, who had stood on the bridge when the hull cracked, was barely conscious. Of the other 33 men, only 18 bodies were ever recovered. 15 were never found. The lake, as the local saying went, had kept its own. The formal investigation opened in Detroit in December of 1958, conducted jointly by the Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board. Fleming testified for 2 days. Mays testified for 1. Both described the same sequence: shudder, crack, rapid list, water entering the hull. The Bradley had undergone its last full inspection in the spring of 1958. It received a certificate of seaworthiness before departing for the season. Inspection reports from 1956 and 1957 contained specific language. The phrase "stress cracking noted" appeared in the hull assessment sections. Alongside that phrase was a second: recommend monitoring, not require repair, not prohibit departure. A suggestion written on a form, filed and archived. Michigan Limestone had reviewed those reports. The company's maintenance superintendent testified that the identified cracks were within acceptable parameters for continued operation. The board asked what those parameters were based on. The superintendent cited industry standards. The board pressed, did those standards account for a 31-year-old hull? The superintendent said the standards were the standards. The board recorded the answer and moved forward. No further clarifying question appears in the transcript. One piece of testimony received less attention than it warranted. It came from dock worker Gerald Tonkin, stationed at the repair facility in Calcite, Michigan. Tonkin had worked on the Bradley during its winter layover. He testified that he had identified visible corrosion on hull plating near the stern. That corrosion was not present in the official inspection document. It had formed beneath the paint layer, invisible to a standard surface examination. Tonkin reported this to his supervisor. His supervisor told him the inspector had already signed off on the hull. The matter was considered closed. Tonkin's testimony occupies 4 pages of the inquiry transcript. The board asked 3 clarifying questions. No further investigation of his specific observation was ordered. The company maintained throughout the proceedings that the Bradley met all regulatory requirements on its departure date. Technically and legally, that statement was accurate. The inquiry established the fracture location, approximately 40 meters from the stern, at the section containing the number 7 ballast tank. Engineering analysis concluded the fracture initiated at a weld seam, where a repair weld had been applied over fatigued steel rather than replacing it. A repair weld over fatigued steel does not restore original strength. It covers the visible damage. The stress concentration remains beneath the surface. The board's final report, released in April of 1959, listed structural failure in severe weather as the official cause of the sinking. It did not assign individual liability. It did not name the company as negligent. It recommended improved protocols for aging vessels. And then it was filed. Tonkin's 4 pages sat in that filing system alongside the signed seaworthiness certificate. Both told the truth. Only one had ever carried any regulatory weight. There was one more document the board had not obtained. Captain Barch of the freighter Munson had spoken to colleagues about Bryan's spring inquiry to the company. Brian had asked Michigan Limestone directly whether a structural review was planned before the 1958 season. The company's response does not appear in the record. The board did not call Barch as a witness. Brian's spring inquiry to Michigan Limestone was never entered into the official record. In April of 1959, the report was published and the investigation closed. The certificate remained the system's final word, with no mechanism to reconcile it against Tonkin's testimony. 33 families in Rogers City had received news that no investigation could change. The lake held 15 of those men permanently, beneath an inscription the widows had not chosen. Rogers City received the news of the sinking in stages, beginning with evening radio bulletins that reported only a distress signal somewhere on the lake. By 9 o'clock that night, the town understood the ship had gone down. By midnight, the search had found almost nothing in the water. The population of Rogers City was 3,800 people. 23 of the 35 men aboard were from that town or its immediate surrounding area. In a town that size, 23 men is not an abstraction. It is the hardware store owner's son. It is the man who coached Little League. It is 3 brothers from the same street. It is the kind of loss that reaches every household within a matter of blocks. The Krawczak family lost 2 sons, Dennis and Gary. The Selke family lost a father and an uncle. The Budnick family lost the eldest of 4 brothers. The Rogers City Methodist Church held a memorial service on November 23rd. Every pew was occupied. Reverend Harold Moll spoke for 40 minutes. Halfway through his remarks, Reverend Moll stopped completely. He stood in silence at the pulpit for nearly a full minute before he was able to continue. The company sent a representative. He sat in the 3rd row. After the service, several widows refused to acknowledge him in the entrance hall. One woman, whose name the local paper chose not to print, told a reporter she had nothing to say to anyone from US Steel. The maritime community's reaction differed from the civilian one. Captains and mates on the Great Lakes routes knew the Bradley's inspection record. Among themselves, in dock offices and waiting rooms at the Detroit Maritime Exchange, they spoke about what the inquiry was unlikely to surface, not because of a conspiracy, because of a system, and the system had operated exactly as it was designed to operate in every detail. Captain Otto Barch of the freighter Munson had known Roland Bryan for 15 years. He gave a brief interview to the Detroit Free Press in January of 1959. Barch said Bryan was one of the most careful men he had known on the water. Bryan had expressed concerns about the Bradley's condition to colleagues the previous spring. Bryan had asked Michigan Limestone directly whether a more thorough structural review was planned before the 1958 navigation season began. The company's response does not appear in the investigation record. The board did not call Captain Barch as a witness at any point in the proceedings. The Christian Sartori's logbook was entered into evidence. Captain Wendling's entries document the timeline. Bradley's lights sighted at 1710, course changed at 1735. The Sartori reached the debris field at 2240, 5 hours and 5 minutes to cover 19 kilometers. The engines had been at maximum output. Searchlights swept roughly 1 square kilometer of debris. Life rings, a deck chair, a section of wooden railing. No raft was visible at those coordinates. The raft with Mays and Fleming had drifted approximately 3 kilometers northeast of the primary debris field, driven by the wind that had broken the ship. A Coast Guard helicopter found them at first light. 2 figures on the platform, both alive, both barely conscious after 14 hours in freezing conditions. The rescue of Mays and Fleming was the only good news to come from the entire search and recovery operation on Lake Michigan that November. 15 men remained on the bottom of the lake. Their families waited for news that never came. The search was formally suspended days later. In Rogers City, the hardware stores and churches and school hallways carried a particular silence in the weeks following November 18th. Every block of that town held someone who had lost a father, a brother, a son, or a husband. The density of loss was unlike anything since the war. Captain Barch gave one more interview, to the Rogers City newspaper in December of 1958. He said Brian had been trying to do the right thing. He said Brian had asked the right questions that spring. He said the answers Brian received, or failed to receive, were what had mattered in the end. That interview occupied 4 column inches on an inside page. It was not picked up by any wire service. It was not cited in the formal inquiry. Brian's spring inquiry to Michigan limestone, Barcher's testimony about it, and Tonkin's 4 pages of corrosion notes sat in 3 separate places, none of them the official record. 35 years after the sinking, a private diving expedition located the Carl D. Bradley on the floor of Lake Michigan, at a depth of approximately 110 meters. The hull rested in 2 pieces. Remotely operated cameras filmed the wreck for the first time, producing footage the 1959 inquiry could never have obtained. At the stern break, steel plating around the No. 7 ballast tank showed a tearing pattern consistent with metal fatigue originating at a weld seam. This was not a clean fracture from sudden overload. It was a propagating crack, one that had been advancing through the steel for years before the storm. The cameras documented the repair weld itself, visible at the exact fracture point. It was positioned precisely where the engineering analysis from 1959 had placed it. The original fatigue crack beneath that weld had run approximately 60 centimeters before the repair was applied in 1955. The repair covered it. The fatigue continued. In the 3 years between the repair and November 1958, the steel beside the weld continued weakening. The weld held. The metal around it did not. Gerald Tonkin was still alive in 1993. A journalist covering the diving expedition tracked him down and asked whether the footage had surprised him. Tonkin said it had not. He said he had known what the cameras would find. He used one word to describe the dismissal of his 1958 report: routine. Tonkin died in 1997. His testimony from the inquiry and his 1993 interview form one of the clearest threads in the documentary record. A man identified corrosion on a hull, reported it, was dismissed, and was proven correct 35 years later by cameras on the lake floor. Frank Mays spent the decades after the sinking speaking publicly and specifically. He testified before congressional subcommittees on Great Lakes vessel standards across multiple sessions. Mays never attributed the sinking to the storm. Across 40 years of public statements, he said the storm was the occasion. The cause was the decisions about the steel. Elmer Fleming left the Great Lakes maritime trade entirely. He moved his family from Rogers City to a smaller community in northern Michigan and rarely spoke publicly. Fleming gave one extended interview to maritime historian David Swayze in 1981. He described the moment on the bridge when the hull moved beneath him. He said it felt like the ship telling you it was already over. No decision made on the bridge at that point could have changed anything. Swayze asked Fleming whether he had been formally notified of what prior maintenance reports had contained about the hull's structural condition before the '58 season. Fleming said he had received no such communication from Michigan Limestone. He had assumed the maintenance program had addressed whatever the reports contained. He paused in the recording for approximately 30 seconds. Then he said reasonable assumptions had cost 33 men their lives. The inquiry board had never asked Fleming this question directly. His answer in 1981 did not appear in any subsequent regulatory document. Swayze's interview notes include one additional detail Fleming offered unprompted at the end. He said Brian had told him that spring that he had concerns about the hull's condition. Brian had not specified the nature of those concerns to Fleming. But Fleming said Brian had used the word condition more than once in that conversation. Fleming said he had not asked Brian to elaborate. In retrospect, he said, that was one more missed opportunity for someone to ask the right question. The underwater footage was reviewed by 2 independent engineering consultants who had not been involved in the original inquiry. Both confirmed fatigue failure originating at the repair weld. One consultant noted that the tearing pattern suggested the crack had reached a critical threshold before the ship ever entered the November storm. His written assessment stated that in his judgment, the Bradley would have failed structurally at that location within 1 to 3 additional navigation seasons, regardless of weather. That assessment was submitted to the Michigan Underwater Preserve Advisory Board in 1994. It was not submitted to any federal regulatory body. The wreck was designated a protected maritime gravesite under the Michigan Underwater Preserve System in 1995. Recreational diving on the wreck is prohibited. The cameras that prove Tonkin right are stored in a research archive in Michigan. The footage is available to researchers. The assessment sits beside it, unsubmitted. The 1993 expedition had confirmed what Tonkin reported in 1958 and what Fleming described in 1981. All 3 accounts pointed to the same weld seam. The wrongful death suits filed by the Bradley families entered the Michigan courts in 1959. The litigation against Michigan Limestone and U.S. Steel lasted 4 years. The company's defense rested on 3 arguments. The vessel was certified, the weather was extraordinary, and the convergence of factors was unforeseeable at the time of departure. The family's attorneys challenged all 3 arguments. The hull's condition was documented. A November gale on Lake Michigan was not extraordinary. It was statistically expected. The word foreseeable would define the entire litigation. A certified hull in extraordinary weather is a tragedy. A documented deficient hull in predictable conditions is something else. In 1963, the cases were settled out of court. The settlement terms were sealed by mutual agreement. No company official was found personally liable. Several widows refused the settlement initially. Their attorneys persuaded them that a sealed agreement represented the maximum recoverable outcome under the applicable law. Most accepted the terms. 3 did not. Those remaining cases were dismissed on procedural grounds. No ruling on the negligence arguments was ever issued by any court. The financial terms of the settlement have never been confirmed publicly. Michigan Limestone did not admit liability. The official position remained that the sinking was a weather event. In Rogers City, the waterfront memorial was dedicated in the years following the settlement. A granite marker lists all 35 names, the 33 dead and the 2 survivors. The Widows Committee had originally proposed an inscription using the words "lost to negligence." The City Council voted to change it before the dedication ceremony. The approved inscription reads, "Lost to the lake." A council member later told a local historian he had believed the original wording created legal exposure for the town. The historian recorded this explanation in a footnote in his 1988 account of the sinking. The decision it describes is not a small one. A community chose language that protected the company rather than language the records supported. The widows who had proposed the original inscription did not attend the dedication. The Bradley's sister vessel, the SS Cedarville, continued operating for Michigan Limestone after the '58 disaster. Its early 1960s inspection records carry identical language. The notations read, "Stress monitoring recommended, weld seams flagged for observation." The same phrases applied to a second aging hull, sailing the same routes for the same owner. The Cedarville sank in May of 1965 in the Straits of Mackinac. 10 men died. Hull condition was cited as a contributing factor in the damage assessment. 2 ships, same fleet, same owner, same inspection language. The second disaster arrived 7 years after the first. The pattern was visible in the documentary record. Maritime historian Swayze published a comparative analysis of Great Lakes sinkings from 1940 to 1980. Vessels owned by industrial conglomerates showed higher late-season failure rates. His explanation focused on incentive structure. An independent operator faced personal ruin if he lost a hull. A corporate division faced a balance sheet entry and a regulatory inquiry. Swayze's paper appeared in a maritime history journal. It was never cited in a federal regulatory proceeding. It was never reported in the mainstream press. It sits in the archives of the Great Lakes Maritime Institute in Detroit, available to anyone who knows to look for it and recognizes what the pattern means. The Cedarville disaster the Swayze analysis, and the sealed settlement from the Bradley litigation together form a documentary record that no single federal body was required to review. The inspection framework that certified the Bradley in the spring of 1958 was the same framework that certified the Cedarville 7 years later. The framework was not revised after the Bradley. It was not revised after the Cedarville. The Great Lakes Fleet continued operating under its terms for another decade. In 1968, the Widows Committee from Rogers City submitted a formal letter to the Coast Guard requesting a review of inspection standards for aging vessels. The letter cited the Bradley's inspection history, the Inquiry Board's 1959 recommendations, and the subsequent Cedarville disaster as evidence that the recommendations had not been implemented. The Coast Guard acknowledged receipt of the letter. The acknowledgement noted that inspection standards fell under the jurisdiction of multiple federal agencies. No coordinated review was initiated. The letter, the acknowledgement, and the 1959 recommendations all remained separate documents in separate filing systems, with no mechanism to require reconciliation. Frank Mays received a copy of the Coast Guard's acknowledgement letter. He kept it in a file folder with the inquiry transcript and a photograph of the Bradley in port. He said the acknowledgement letter was the clearest example he had seen of a system responding to something without acting on it. The spring 1958 inspection certificate for the Carl D. Bradley is held in the National Archives in Washington. It is a single page, signed and stamped. It declares the vessel seaworthy. It sits in the same federal record system as Tonkin's 4 pages about the corrosion the inspector did not identify. Both documents are accurate within their own terms. The inspector applied the tools and standards he was given. Those tools were not designed to detect subsurface metal fatigue. Non-destructive testing using ultrasound and magnetic particle methods could locate internal fatigue cracks without cutting into a hull. These methods were available in the mid-1950s. They were in use in bridge engineering and aircraft manufacturing before the Bradley last sailed. They were not required for Great Lakes freight vessel hull inspection. Michigan limestone did not use them on the Bradley. The regulations did not require them. A visual inspection and a certified signature were all the system demanded. The Inquiry Board's 1959 report recommended that improved inspection methods be adopted for aging vessels. That recommendation entered the regulatory record as a suggestion. It was not converted into an enforceable requirement. The Great Lakes Fleet continued sailing aging hulls under the same visual inspection framework for the next 17 years. In 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald sank in a Lake Superior November storm. All 29 crew members were lost. Congressional testimony cited the Bradley case explicitly. Witnesses at the 1976 hearings described the same failure mode, the same regulatory gap, and the same institutional pattern. 17 years apart, same month, same system. The Port and Tanker Safety Act of 1978 mandated non-destructive hull testing for aging bulk carriers on the Great Lakes. It became law 20 years after the Bradley sank. By the time the act passed, the Rogers City families had been living with a sealed settlement and a granite inscription they had not written for 2 full decades. Frank Mays returned to Rogers City every November 18th for the rest of his life. He named all 33 men at every event he attended. He never used notes. He died in 2011. He said the men deserved to be remembered as specific individuals, not as a statistic or a regulatory reference. The fracture point on the wreck is still visible in the 1993 expedition footage. The weld repair sits 110 meters down, 11 miles from shore. 3 subsequent inspection cycles passed over that weld between 1955 and 1958. Each produced a signed certificate. Each said the ship was safe. The most consistent explanation for the sinking is not the storm. It is the gap between what the inspection system was designed to find and what the hull contained. That gap was the product of standards written without accounting for hull age, without requiring subsurface testing, and without converting recommendations into enforceable obligations. Michigan Limestone operated within those standards completely. The company did not break the rules. The rules themselves were the mechanism that allowed a failing hull to depart. The 33 men aboard on November 18th did not know about the weld repair beneath the paint near the number 7 ballast tank. They trusted the certificate. The certificate was the system's final word. Everything Tonkins saw, everything Brian suspected, everything the prior reports had flagged, none of it could override a signed document. Frank Mays said refusing to accept unforeseeable weather as the final word had mattered, even though it took 20 years to become enforceable law. The act that finally required subsurface hull testing was named for port and tanker safety, not for the 33 men whose deaths had made the argument necessary. Their families had submitted formal letters, attended congressional hearings, and waited 20 years for a law that did not bear the name of the disaster that required it. The fracture point, the certificate, and Tonkins' 4 pages sit in record systems that were never required to be reconciled before a hull was cleared to sail. The 1959 recommendations, the widow's letter, and the Cedarville disaster sat in separate filing systems for 9 years before any coordinated regulatory response was attempted. Rogers City holds a memorial service every year on November 18th. The granite marker at the waterfront still reads, "Lost to the lake." It has not been changed. The inscription the widows proposed, "Lost to negligence," was overruled once by a city council vote to protect the town from legal exposure that never materialized. The records that supported the original inscription are available in public archives. The inspection certificate, the inquiry transcript, and Tonkins' testimony can all be requested. Would the Bradley have sailed that November if those 3 records had been reconciled?